now, obviously has come now to us. On examination, a non-tender lump in the thyroid, 3 to 3 centimeter, right lobe of the thyroid. So, Dr. Arvind, if I can start with you, what further workup would you like from this point on?
No, we would normally check for the thyroid function tests.
Right.
Then we would also look into an ultrasound evaluation. Of course, clinical evaluation would also entail completion of the complete examination of the neck and indirect laryngoscopy to check for the vocal cord status. So that would be the part of the physical examination. Subsequently, of course, as I said, thyroid function test to look at the thyroid function status, an ultrasound, and definitely an FNAC, preferably a guided FNAC from this nodule. That's the solitary presenting nodule.
Dr. Naik, do you expect any odd thyroid findings in this? We do thyroid function routinely, but would anything suggest to you that you need to do something else other than a thyroid cancer?
No, I didn't get the question.
So
the routine investigations would be what Dr. Arvind just said. The FNAC, the ultrasound, and the thyroid function test. Are you asking something in addition?
I was asking the importance of the thyroid function test. Do you expect it to be abnormal in a carcinoma thyroid, or is it just as a basic routine we have to do it?
Usually, most of the thyroid cancer patients will be euthyroid, and if at all you see some hypothyroidism, it's usually due to associated thyroiditis. So it's very, very unlikely that a thyroid cancer patient will either be hyper or hypothyroid by per se. But if there is a lot of patients do have associated thyroiditis, so you can have hypothyroidism due to that. But the malignancy itself doesn't normally alter the thyroid function, as we know it.
Perfect. So aside from the routine hematological test, a cardiac evaluation, and an endoscopy would be part of all workup, I presume. So coming to the USG neck, which you were talking about, this is the TIRAD score. How commonly are we using it? Dr. Arvind, are you seeing this routinely used in your clinical practice?
Unfortunately, no, but this is something that is recommended. So I think any center that has a dedicated sonologist who should ideally report in a thyroid system. So it would sort of give a good message to the clinician. But somehow in our center we have not been able to sort of have the dedicated sonologist to give the thyroid scoring.
Dr. Senthil, what about your center? Do you get this thyroid score? Because it is a little complicated, though over the end it seems reasonably okay.
Actually, to be truthful to myself, to yourself and all the audience, generally if I see a thyroid swelling and then it looks like malignancy, somebody comes to me with an FNA report like that, I dutifully send it off to my head and neck surgeon. I don't try to handle it because I'm not good at it. I'm not, literate at what should be done next. But, just to quickly answer the question that you asked, I vaguely remember seeing some ultrasound reports which talk about these scores, but I haven't really gone into the nitty-gritty of it to check what it means and what they do with it.
Right. Dr. Mohan, any experience with regard to this thyroid score? Are we routinely getting, or to be honest, like Dr. Senthil, I don't see much of it, but the few I have seen, I don't remember seeing such a score.
So, as Dr. Arvind rightly pointed out, if you have a dedicated sonologist, somebody who is really into thyroid sonology, you get all these things. And as you also pointed out, it's something that would be very helpful for us to then say, okay, risk stratify simply, and then say which way are we going? Are we going down the benign route or are we going down the malignancy route? If you've got something which is in thyroid 4 or 5 category, you know that you're going down the malignancy route, and you can then plan accordingly. Yes, we do get routine thyroid scores where we are, but then you need dedicated sonologists. Yeah.
Right.
Vamsi, I just wanted to add, with regards to thyroid, it's been described more than a decade ago. In fact, it is only for the nodules that are more than a centimeter. So it is generally not for nodules that are sub-centimeter. In fact, the ATA guidelines actually said that if there is any nodule less than a centimeter, you don't really evaluate it. So the thyroid was actually made up of nodules that are more than a centimeter. That is something that we need to keep in mind.
That's a good point. I was aware of that, to be honest. Great. Yeah. Dr. Naik, even without a thyroid, if just a report says that there is a suspicious nodule, that's enough for us to proceed in a routine clinical practice, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, basically, now to just talk about thyroid, it's something which has probably come in the last few years. And although as clinicians, we would like more and more radiologists to report thyroid, it's not been happening as frequently as we would like it to, because that makes our job easier when we see a suspicious nodule and we are not very sure how to proceed next. Because when an FNAC is like Bethesda 3 or 4, a lot of times we use the ultrasound guidance as to decide and counsel the patient what is the importance and the requirement for surgery and the risks of malignancy. This is where the thyroid score will come in. So even though most of the reports I see don't necessarily mention the thyroid score, we do look at certain points which you have mentioned in the thyroid grading as to what all are there. For example, the presence of hyperechoic lesion, the shape, the echogenicity, calcification, all these things are assessed by us without actually looking at the thyroid score or totaling it, which should be done by a radiologist. So that by the ultrasound, findings do make a big difference to us for subsequent management of the patient. With or without a formal thyroid score, we still use ultrasound significantly to guide our next management. So my request to, if any radiologists are there in the audience, that we should probably start popularizing this and try to kind of, make the clinician's jobs a little more easier as to how to proceed once you have an FNAC of, benign or suspected or malignancy. Of course, if you have a suspected or a malignancy, don't really need the thyroid score. It is only for the initial, at least a 1 to 4 or 1 to 3 probably where it can help you. Perfect. So,
Hello?
No, the other.
I would just like to add that in Tata Memorial Hospital, for the last 1 or 2 years, radiologists have been regularly providing the thyroid score.
That is good to know. That is good to know.
Again, Vamsi, what as Dr. Naik said, we tend to say if there is a hypoechoic nodule, if it's irregular margins, if there are microcalcifications, if it's taller than wider. So all these things are sort of pointers for malignancy. So, and that is exactly what they do in the thyroid, but we tend to sort of take them from individual based on what the radiologist have been doing.
So
I agree we should. Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. So CT scan neck, CT scan chest, do you routinely need them or do you avoid doing a CT scan because of this iodinated contrast and what it can cause a problem?
Yeah, I mean, there is a specific indication when we, in conditions in which we ask for CT scan. It's essentially when you feel that clinically the thyroid mobility is restricted and you're suspecting any gross extrathyroidal extension. So these are the indications, or you have a very large nodal masses where they're in the lower part of the neck. So in any of these circumstances, cross-sectional imaging and more often than not, we tend to prefer a CT scan. With contrast, the issue again is that there is a controversy that it would subsequently hamper on the subsequent iodine therapies if you are to give. But I think over the years we have known that if there is a 2-month gap between the occurrence of between the performance of an iodinated CT scan and the doing of the therapy, you should be good, and the effect of stunning may not be there.
So, Dr.
Yeah, I think as Dr. Arvind said, iodinated contrast in a CT, it's always kind of it worries you whether it would hamper with the iodine uptake in the post-surgical setting. However, I think with the newer iodinated contrast, the amount of iodine is far less compared to what it used to be before. So with 1 month's gap between a contrast CT and the radioiodine ablation, I think we are quite comfortably able to go ahead with it. So in a way, even if you did a CCT, by the time you have done the surgery and then you have allowed for 3 weeks for the TSH to come up, you're already past the 4-week kind of window that we require, and it's usually not an issue at all.
Great. So it is not a 2 month, it's even a 1 month is good enough according to what you're saying.
Definitely a month because of the newer iodinated contrast that, the level of iodine are much better.
Perfect.
Dr. Vamsi, can I make a comment?
Sure, sir. Sure.
See, basically, I mean, for the participants, I would like to say that CT is not a routine part of the evaluation of a thyroid cancer. Let us get it very clear, because majority of the thyroid cancers we see are early stage in the younger age group, and they are not invasive. The only role for a CT scan or any imaging beyond an ultrasound in a thyroid cancer is when you are suspecting local invasion, like Dr. Arvind said. Otherwise, just because it's large this patient has some problems. No. The only reason to do a CT scan is to determine local invasion so that you are better prepared during your surgical resection. However, if it is not going to alter your surgical management, it is better to avoid, because it's not just because of the iodinated contrast problem. It is generally why do an investigation which is not going to add to your ultimate management. Because today ultrasound has reached a level where a lot of information about thyroid, you can get it from the ultrasound. So reserve CT scan only where it is clinically indicating local invasion and where it's going to change your surgical management. So here, whether the contrast affects it or not, if it is critical information you're going to get, you can worry about whether the contrast is going to affect your iodine therapy or not much later, because right now your priority is to do a good operation. And if you say that I do not want to do a CT just because there may be a problem and do a half-hearted surgery without really understanding the invasion of the cancer, you are actually doing a disservice. So where it is indicated, it should be done with contrast. But don't do it routinely.
Absolutely spot on, doctor.
So any role for MRI neck? Because as medical oncologists, all of us feel okay, CT should not be done. Let's just do an MRI. That's a reflex thinking. Is there any benefit of doing an MRI for in any specific case, or it's not really indicated?
No, again,
Dr. Arvind, please go ahead.
No, again, as Dr. said that we would not do it routinely, but sometimes if there is some degree of ambiguity, you can do an MRI, and sometimes for esophageal involvement, they say that MRIs could be better, and you could also supplant it by doing what is called as an endoscopic ultrasound also in some of these cases, and especially for those subtle esophageal involvement in which these tend to be better off, but more often than not, I think clinicians, we tend to prefer CT scans as and when it's required. And again, I reiterate, not for the regular run-of-the-mill cases, only for the cases in which the mobility is restricted, you suspect gross extra thyroid extension.
Perfect. So FNAC, both of you have spoken about USG guided is good enough, or you even can do a manual. You normally prefer a USG guided, I guess. Dr. Nayak, Dr. Arvind.
Basically, ultrasound guided FNAC, the only advantage of an ultrasound guided FNAC in a palpable nodule is that you can hit certain areas which may look more suspicious, the spot in the thyroid nodule which you may think is more suspicious. But generally, if you have a thyroid cancer and it's quite obvious, we don't need to do an ultrasound guided, because it's very obvious the mass will be, has a clinical characteristic, and anybody with their eyes closed would be able to hit the right spot. I know the whole thyroid is malignant. The whole lobe is malignant. But in certain situations wherein there is a nodule which has probably a low possibility of being malignant clinically, then an ultrasound guided FNAC may help you in pointing your needle to the correct spot and getting material from that. Other than that, a routinely large palpable nodule, I don't think I've seen a lot of practice amongst physicians who see thyroids first, who ask every patient to go for an ultrasound guided FNAC without understanding the difficulties a patient has to face to schedule another appointment, then costs, etc. So I think routinely one doesn't require an ultrasound guided FNAC unless there is a specific reason for doing it.
Okay. Dr. Munita, FNAC will come to you. Are you happy with what Dr. Nayak says? A blind FNAC is good enough, or you would prefer a USG guided in all cases?
I wouldn't call it blind, obviously, but
obviously.
So if it is a palpable mass and it's a huge big mass, then definitely there is no problem that you don't need a guided ultrasound. But if the swelling is small, if the nodule is not very well localized, then ultrasound will definitely improve the accuracy.
Perfect. So coming to our patient,
can I just chip in one thing, Vamshi, is you might say, when you're doing an FNA, I think in addition to probably if you have an ultrasound guidance, it's fantastic, because the incremental benefit is there, but 20% of cases where to hit the right spot, as Dr. Nayak said, but also to have a technician, a pathologist, who can actually say, have you got enough material to actually say, give a diagnostic answer? That's the most crucial bits of this, I would say.
So, Dr. Munita, is that being routinely practiced in TMH? I know how busy TMH is. I don't think it will be feasible there. But what do you have to say?
So we do have ultrasound guided FNACs, and we have a rapid on-site evaluation as well, which is called as ROSE. So we do send our technician to assess us on-site. So it definitely improves the adequacy rate. So we have significantly reduced our non-diagnostic rates because of introducing this on-site evaluation. So if your setup allows that, that is an excellent way to improve your adequacy.
So great. That's an excellent point you have made. So again, that's a teaching for me as well. So if any person listening, if you can get your pathologist in, and as ma'am says, if you have the setup, please go ahead with it. Great. So coming back to our patient, this patient on ultrasound had a solid nodule of 3 centimeter with hyperechogenicity. So all the other features are matching. Normal thyroid profile. A CT scan was done because there was some fixity, and that showed tumor arising from the right lobe and isthmus with intratracheal extension involving second, third, and fourth tracheal rings. So a locally advanced disease. Right. These were the imaging findings. This, as you can see, is the image going into the trachea, from what I can understand. And then I'm coming back to you. The Bethesda classification. Are we using, in TMH, I'm sure you're using it routinely, but can you just walk us through this a bit?
Yes, so for FNAC thyroid, ever since 2007, Bethesda was introduced. We have been using Bethesda classification, and that is a standard worldwide. And centers which are not using, or pathologists who are not using, should be encouraged to use this, because this allows more uniformity and standardization of reports. And it also provides an advantage because it gives you a risk of malignancy associated with each category. So in Bethesda, we have 6 categories, starting from category 1, which tells you it is non-diagnostic. And in this situation, repeat should be performed, especially if the ultrasound shows high-risk features. Second category is benign. These are cases which have less than 3% cancer risk, and they can be followed up clinically, or they can be just observed. The category number 3, 4, and 5 are the ones which we call as the indeterminate categories. The third is the atypia of uncertain significance, which is basically a lesion which has 15% cancer risk. These are the situations, and number 4 is the one which has follicular neoplasm, which has 15 to 30% cancer risk. In US category, what is recommended is a repeat evaluation after 3 months. And if the ultrasound is suspicious. And in 4th category, diagnostic lobectomy is recommended to rule out any invasive follicular carcinoma or a malignancy. In category 5, which is suspicious because it has a high risk of cancer malignancy, total thyroidectomy is recommended. And 6th is malignant, which is clear-cut malignant surgery, total thyroid.
All right. So, ma'am, at this point, I'll just bring in a couple of questions which are coming in from the audience. Dr. Lalit, Dr. Satish Srinivasan has asked that in a patient with metastatic anaplastic thyroid cancer, is it safe to do a core thyroid? Is there any risk of local fungation? Dr. Nayak, would you like to take that?
Sorry, I didn't get that question. What is
so the question is, in a metastatic anaplastic thyroid cancer, is it safe to do a core biopsy from the thyroid? Is there a risk of local fungation?
True cut, you mean? Yeah, that's generally the routine thing which is done for anaplastic thyroid cancer. We don't really want to do an open biopsy. However, if an FNAC is able to give us all the information we require, because in an anaplastic thyroid cancer, there is something more we require just than a diagnosis. And a core biopsy is definitely okay to do.
Safe. Core biopsy is safe, is what you're.
Yeah, as long as you're not hitting the carotids and stuff. I mean, you should be experienced doing core biopsies and know the location and things like that. But yes, in experience sense, is absolutely safe.
So, Dr. Mohan, if I can ask you, Dr. Lalit Mohan wants to know that when do we admit the thyroid scan in a patient with thyroid? I think that's not germane to this discussion. I guess it's in a place where you don't suspect a thyroid malignancy. Am I correct?
Yeah. Actually, it goes back to your first question, initial questions. What is the role of thyroid functions? What would you look for? If the TSH is actually suppressed, many times you may not have overt clinical hyperthyroidism. You may have subclinical hyperthyroidism with a suppressed TSH and a solitary nodule. in those kind of cases, a technetium thyroid scan if you do, and if you see a hot nodule, you are home and dry. You don't need to worry about sampling either, because the chance of malignancy is extremely low. So, that's a hot nodule, and you treat it as per, radioiodine ablation. So that's the way you go down. But, otherwise, a routine use of thyroid scan for thyroid cancer in the diagnostic setting, no. There is not a visual.
Perfect. I think that's a very, very vehement and very clear answer. In a setting of a thyroid cancer, no thyroid scan. Perfect. So our patient, a USG guided FNAC was done. It showed a papillary carcinoma, that is Bethesda 6. A fiber optic examination showed that both cords were mobile. Dr. Munita, coming back to you, this is something which I found rather interesting. What about molecular studies pre-operative? Are you doing it routinely in the Bethesda 3, 4, 5, or are you not doing that?
So for 5 and 6, the diagnosis is already there, and clinical decision making would be of surgery. It's only in cases of indeterminate that we can choose to do molecular to further try it, whether we want to do active continuous surveillance or whether we want to do surgery. So follicular has a role in indeterminate category of AUS and follicular neoplasm.
But are we doing it routinely? I mean, I am myself not a so I'm asking.
It is not a routine. We have available the testing. We have NGS available. We have BRAF testing available. It is not a routine. It is asked on a sporadic, on an isolated case, but not a routine.
Okay, Dr. Naik, do we do this? I mean, have you seen this molecular diagnostics being done, or what's your impression on this? Are we following?
We did start BRAF testing for Bethesda 3 FNACs, but we didn't really find that it made a big difference. However, we are trying to encourage pathologists to start doing BRAF for post-surgical, following surgery. So we're just starting to do it in the last few months. I can't really say that we've done a lot of cases, but yeah, we have had a couple of positives and few are mostly negatives. So, but yeah, we are trying to get into it.
Okay, this was something news to me, so it's interesting that we are going down this path. Again, this is NCCN.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
This is Dr. Shobna. I just wanted to know that when you do a molecular testing and you have BRAF or any other molecular marker which comes positive, would it change your management in any way?
Dr. Naik? Dr.
They would automatically see now. Basically, post-surgery, we do have patients in the high-risk category and the low-risk category. And as we know, the low-risk category and the high-risk category patients are followed up completely differently. Although without the BRAF itself, we can categorize into high-risk and low-risk with regards to their thyroxine doses, follow-up, and subsequent risk of relapse, etc., etc., etc. BRAF may be one more factor which can help you determine that this patient would be in the high risk. So automatically, even if all other clinical criteria of the patient falls into the low risk category, if it's BRAF positive, you automatically put the patient into the high risk category. So that's probably what difference it would make. As far as BRAF in FNAC is concerned, it has been recommended for Bethesda 3 where you're not sure what is the next step. So if a BRAF is positive on an FNAC in the Bethesda 3 category, definitely the patient is not going to be kept on follow-up, but going to be operated. So BRAF in FNAC and in anal histopath are two different things.
So there are, I would just like to add here that molecular testing can be done in 3 scenarios. One is the pre-operative scenario where you have FNAC which is indeterminate and you want to take it forward whether you want to do surveillance or you want to operate or you want to increase your extent of surgery. So that is one scenario, and that is the scenario where you have AUS and follicular neoplasm category. So if you find a mutation, that tells you that you cannot follow up this patient. It has a high positive predictive value and it has a high chance of being malignant. So surgery, these rules in it becomes a rule in test and it becomes a indication for surgery. In the other option, which doctor was saying, was the post-operative, where you do a risk stratification for prognosis, where you are trying to identify high-risk genetic markers to determine what is the prognosis after the patient has been operated. And the third scenario where molecular testing is done is when you are looking for a targeted in a metastatic setting, where you have certain mutation present and you can use any actionable mutation for a targeted therapy. So these are the three different clinical scenarios where molecular testing can be used.
I think that was very well summarized in three different areas. So, Dr. Arvind, if I can start with you for a couple of questions. Dr. Roshni Pandey has asked that in follicular CA, FNAC may be negative. Would you still go for a surgery with a negative FNAC?
Yeah, that is expected. Because in a follicular cancer, to actually demonstrate it as a carcinoma, and I think Munita would be the best to answer, you require a capsular and a vascular invasion, which will not be seen in an FNAC. So you obviously have to sort of, do something more only. Although there are some expert cytopathologists who may be able to sort of, do it, but that's not something which is routine. And the other thing, Vamsi, I just wanted to add on this, the molecular testing, because that's important. There are three quick points I will make. I know in the interest of time. In case of a diagnostic setting, I think doing only BRAF alone may not be wise or prudent. Although we have sort of, have some sort of a publication in the post-operative setting in which we have done, and one of the few studies of BRAF positivity we have published it in India. But in the pre-operative setting, you either do what was earlier called as a rule-in or rule-out test, or now what is called as a combined test, like a thyroseq that you tend to sort of do it. If you do it as a only BRAF, if you get to know in an FNAC setting, and that's what Shobna's question was, I think there is some suggestion that I think everybody needs to know that the presence of BRAF positivity indicates aggressiveness. More chances of lymph node metastasis, more chance of extrathyroidal extension, more chance of distant metastasis. So there is some school of thought right now that is suggesting that even if it's a centimeter nodule, if you have a BRAF positivity in that, then you, because of its aggressive tendency, you need to do a more aggressive surgery in some patients is something of a question mark.
Right.
But as for now, the guidelines say that it is only prognostically relevant. For diagnosis, we don't tend to use much of the BRAF, although in research settings, we tend to some centers tend to use it.
Perfect. Let me take the next question from Dr. Manish Jethani, who asked that if you are suspecting lymphoma, whether to plan for a core biopsy. Yes, we need a core biopsy for a lymphoma. There is no doubt. We need tissue for a biopsy. FNA is not good enough. Dr. Arvind, Dr. Nirmal Kumar wants to know what is the possibility of anaplastic thyroid cancer developing from undetected thyroglossal duct. I mean, it's away from our discussion, but just since he has asked it, if you can give any opinion on this. ATC developing from thyroglossal duct.
No, generally, I think the pathway of these is papillary differentiated, then they go to choroidal differentiated, and then they go to undifferentiated anaplastic. So it's a spectrum. So, and in thyroglossal cyst, the occurrence of papillary carcinoma itself is a slightly rare entity. And you can theoretically have one of these things, but it's pretty rare.
Right. Okay, so for both the surgeons, I'll disappoint you a bit. I won't discuss much about surgery because this is a very mixed forum. We will suffice to say that surgery is done and we will leave it in your safe hands. This patient underwent a total thyroidectomy, central nodal dissection, a tracheal resection, and anastomosis. These are the pictures which have been provided for the surgery. The final HPE showed a 3 centimeter lesion, tall cell variant of papillary carcinoma with extrathyroidal extension present, and 0/5 lymph nodes in the central compartment. So I can start with Dr. Arvind again. When do you start the thyroxine replacement and how do you dose it for the thyroid TSH suppression?
Vamsi, one question.
Sir.
Are you doing screen sharing right now? I'm not seeing it screen.
The others, can you see the screen?
Yeah, I'm seeing.
Yes, sir, we can see your screen.
All right.
Sorry, I can't see your screen.
Maybe log out and log in.
Log out and log in, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys carry on. I'll just log out and log in.
Sure. Dr. Arvind.
Yeah, I think in this patient, it is imperative that we treat this patient with radioiodine therapy first because it's a high risk. Obviously, there is extrathyroidal, there is a tracheal involvement, so the patient definitely would warrant some sort of an adjuvant therapy. And the thyroxine replacement would start subsequently. And again, because he's a high-risk patient, we tend to suppress the TSH to keep the levels around 0.1 nanograms per international units.
So how do you monitor it, if I can ask you? Do you do it every 2 weekly TSH testing, or because I understand 6 to 8 weeks you're anyway going for RAI therapy, right?
Yeah, you do radioiodine therapy and subsequently you start the patient on some high dose. Initially, it all depends. You can either start an empirical dose or you can start per kg body weight. And then subsequently, in a month's time, you tend to repeat the thyroid function test and see the level of suppression. So the level of suppression needs to be high for the high-risk patients. And similarly, intermediate, we go between 0.5, for low risk 0.5 to 2, for intermediate 0.1 to 0.5, and for the high risk it will be around less than 0.1. That's the TSH levels we tend to sort of achieve.
So Dr. Mohan, as a practical point, do you look for a TSH or do you look for the thyroglobulin before you give your radioiodine therapy?
Yeah, I mean, see, there are a couple of things here. One is with the TSH, as Dr. Arvind said, soon after the surgery, you wait for 3 weeks because this patient needs radioiodine treatment. Okay, so 2 to 3 weeks, then you do the TSH. TSH should be elevated sufficiently to ensure the radioiodine is taken up and retained in the residual thyroid. Okay, and the metastatic disease. So at least a TSH of greater than 30 is what we are looking for.
Sorry for interrupting, but this would be just before your radioiodine scan?
Correct. Before the radioiodine treatment, we need to ensure that the TSH is at least greater than 30. Okay. 30 or more. And then we also need a baseline thyroglobulin. Okay, so this gives the baseline. So this is what you start off with, because our aim is to essentially wipe out all the thyroglobulin. So, get it to as close to zero as possible to give an all clear for the patient. So you need a baseline thyroglobulin done.
Right. Dr. Arvind, stimulated and unstimulated, these are terms that especially medical oncologists are not very familiar with. We just say get a thyroglobulin done. But is there a difference between these two, stimulated and unstimulated, and how do you look for these?
Generally, stimulated means that is you give some sort of a recombinant TSH and then you measure the serum thyroglobulin levels. In unstimulated, you actually don't. The patient might be on L-Droxin or thyroxine replacement and still you get the thyroglobulin. It's generally believed that stimulated thyroglobulin is a much more sensitive marker than an unstimulated. That is the thing. But as was pointed out, I think the aim is to get the thyroglobulin levels as close to zero as possible, especially in the high-risk patients.
Would you need a thyroglobulin before RAI scan, or you are comfortable with pushing down the thyroglobulin later on?
In this patient is a high-risk patient because of the virtue of being extrathyroidal and tracheal. So we would actually do the iodine therapy and subsequently we will follow up these patients on a serum thyroglobulin. So serum thyroglobulin is mainly for in the setting of follow-up of these patients.
Follow-up. Very good. So Dr. Nayak, again, we are just discussing the thyroglobulin levels and when to do it. So the consensus is that you first go for your RAI and later on look at the thyroglobulin later on, if I understood everyone correctly.
Sorry, just one little Vamshi. Reason serum thyroglobulin is you've already taken the blood for TSH. Okay.
Yes.
We definitely need the TSH to ensure that the TSH is above 30 before we treat. So when that is done, you may as well get the thyroglobulin as well done.
Baseline thyroglobulin.
So you've got that, and then following on, it helps much easier to kind of do the comparison. As Dr. Arvind said, you really need that for comparing the success of the therapy as you go on.
Perfect. So I think the indications for adjuvant RAI are more or less now clear. When you give a high risk, you definitely use an RAI. One doubt that I have personally got was when you read about this RAI ablation versus therapeutic RAI. Is there any difference between the two, or is that just a terminology? Is it just semantics?
Okay. So, sorry, I presume that was directed to me. I'm sorry.
Yes. To you only.
See, ablation is essentially you are getting rid of the residual thyroid tissue. because we are going to leave behind some amount of thyroid tissue, and ablation pretty much what the terminology you use is actually directing is the iodine directed at that. Now therapeutic as in for the metastatic disease is the when you say radioactive iodine for metastatic thyroid cancer. So that's the basic difference. When you're talking just predominantly ablation, this is the first immediate post-treatment following surgery, because you are also addressing the residual thyroid.
Okay, so if I understand, but there will be a total thyroidectomy done. Usually nowadays it's a total thyroidectomy. Still you expect some tissue left, and you would want the RAI ablation, not a RAI. Therapeutic RAI comes down later down the line, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, I mean, terminology wise, yeah, that would be what it is. As in, ablation is for the residual thyroid tissue. That's all.
Okay. Do you routinely do any pre-therapy scan, or directly if you decide that, for example, this patient has extra thyroid extension, it's tracheal resection, you know you're going to give him a RAI ablation anyways. Would you do a therapy scan also, or would you not do it?
See, different schools of thought. Okay. Now, what is the role? What is the use of doing a pre-therapy scan here? Okay. Now, if that shows you that there is a lot of metastatic disease and that's taking up the iodine, and it's being seen on the pre-therapy scan, you can directly go on to use a much higher dose of iodine in that setting, because given that this is a high-risk case, it's got a lot of local extension, you are expecting probably distant metastasis. So, normally if I did not do anything, my fixed dose would be 100 millicurie or 3000 megabecquerels for this patient. But if somebody did a pre-therapy scan before and found that there was a lot of metastatic disease showing iodine uptake, I might say hike up the iodine dose to a much higher, maybe 7.4, even 200 microcurie or 7.4 gigabecquerel. That would be the only reason why I would use a pre-therapy scan. Otherwise, we know this is a good classical thyroid cancer. We know there is thyroglobulin expression, so you can go ahead with treatment without necessarily needing to do a pre-therapy scan.
Perfect. So, Dr. Arvind, what's your take on this? Do we routinely do in your center pre-therapy scans, or is it just a 100 millicurie as a flat dose given, depending on the risk?
No, as was elegantly pointed out, we always tend to do. I think that there are two schools of thought. One is, of course, in this particular patient, it's a high risk. There is no doubt at all. So there could be one school of thought which can directly give a therapy for this patient, see the follow-up scans, and possibly plan the further therapy. But then what majority of the centers tend to do is exactly what was said. We do a pre-therapy scan to map the extent of the disease. So here we assume that the uptake may not just be local, but it may be at other places. So this patient may have had a lung metastasis or some other metastasis, in which case the dose that you give of radioiodine therapy, as was pointed out, will be much higher. And I'd like to tell that we do a thyroglobulin in these patients also. What I meant in this particular patient, it's a high risk. So you know that this patient has to receive an ablation, and so that is the reason why I said your thyroglobulin in this case will be more relevant in the follow-up setting. But yes, you tend to do a baseline at that time thyroglobulin assessment as well.
Perfect. So this patient received adjuvant high dose of 100 millicurie. Dr. Sendil, if you're there, we don't have a radiation oncologist on this panel, so if you can fill in on any role of EBRT in this setting, any idea about this or any experience?
No, Vamsi, I don't have any experience with indications for EBRT.
Dr. Arvind, Dr. Nayak, any indication for EBRT in a routine patient like this? Or would you want it only where there is a remnant tissue left behind, or is there any indication for EBRT?
No case of routine external beam. In fact, use of external beam RT for the neck itself is slightly controversial. You may tend to use it in some patients in which you have done an R2 resection, that is, you have left behind disease, or if there is an unresectable disease. For some reason you have not been able to operate this patient for extensive locoregional involvement. And only in that case, along with the combination of radioactive iodine therapy, if it's radioactive iodine, you tend to give external beam radiation therapy. Of course, the other indication would be any painful metastasis site like the brain.
Metastasis. I'm talking about adjuvant. Okay.
Yeah, adjuvant, I think very, very less role as a matter of routine.
Perfect. So, Dr. Nayak, just to follow up this patient, how would you like to follow up this patient? We have been discussing about the thyroglobulin. So only thyroglobulin TSH or any other test you would like to do? Dr. Nayak, are you there?
I think he logged out and he hasn't been able
Okay.
to.
He's again logged out. Right. Dr. Mohan, follow up. How do you follow up these patients?
So the follow-up would be, once you have treated them with radioactive iodine, and then you do a post-therapy scan. Okay, before you discharge them, we do a whole body post-therapy scan. That will complete the staging essentially for these patients. So if they've got distant metastasis, if that's showing up, then you know that. So once that is done, you start the patient on thyroxine. And the aim is to, as Dr. Arvind has pointed out previously, high-risk case, less than 0.1. That is the aim, to keep the TSH. And then you get the patient back in 6 months' time when you reassess the situation, when you do a stimulated thyroglobulin and an ultrasound neck. At which point, if the thyroglobulin is high and, the ultrasound is showing residual whatever disease or neck nodes, then you investigate it further and then treat it accordingly, depending on what you find.
Dr. Arvind, role of anti-thyroglobulin antibodies, is it required to be done? What is the significance? Just as a short, if you can tell us.
No, it is something that has to be done along. Every time you ask for a thyroglobulin, you must ask for an anti-thyroglobulin antibody, because in 25% and 1 in 4, there could be an elevation, in which case your thyroglobulin estimation becomes not that much relevant. So you must always do. Again, there is also some school of thought to say that this anti-thyroglobulin antibody levels itself might be prognostic, but there is just evolving evidence on that.
Okay. So, Dr. Nayak, if you have joined back, Dr. Nayak, are you there? I think he has just joined, but anyway, I can't hear him. So, Dr. Arvind, would you send your patients for a routine RAI scan? Because this is again a medical oncologist speaking. For us, every 3 monthly scan is something that is sacrosanct. So, what about thyroid? If you're getting a normal thyroid globulin, normal ultrasound, are you good with that, or do you want to look for RAI scans?
No, I think what was elegantly pointed out is that we tend to look at the post-therapy scan. And the post-therapy scan finding is very, very important. Supposing you have residual activity at that particular point of time, then you more or less make the decision to sort of, take the patient for a re-therapy. A lot of these patients, depending, of course, on the burden of the disease, may require 1 or more doses of radioactive iodine therapy. And the decision is more or less tend to be made in the post-therapy scan or after the index ablation. And only after that, our regular follow-up will be most likely with thyroglobulin, anti-thyroglobulin antibodies and ultrasound. So after doing this, we tend to sort of risk stratify these patients based on the response. Either they have excellent response structurally, whether they have structural disease or not, whether they have excellent responses, or there are 2 other intermediate categories of indeterminate response and biochemical incomplete responses. So that is something that we tend to do in the follow-up of these patients, and the further follow-up of these patients will be determined by how these, in which risk criteria these patients have fallen.
All right. So, Dr. Arvind, since you're there somewhere, Dr. Ramnath wants to know how to do a stimulated thyroglobulin test. Since we discussed the stimulated thyroglobulin, how do you do that test routinely?
You give a recombinant TSH dose, and then you measure serum thyroglobulin levels.
Perfect.
And
I think it's short.
And the antibody levels itself.
So,
or you can do it by stopping the Eltroxin for about 3 to 6 weeks and then do it. So that means you are trying to sort of measure the thyroglobulin when the TSH levels are raised. So that's essentially what is called in the stimulated therapy.
Dr. Mohan, any role of doing routine FDG PET-CT in a follow-up? I'm not talking about dedifferentiation, I'm talking about routine follow-up. Because India has a proliferation of PET-CT scans and a lot of people ready to write that test. Yeah. Any use of this PET-CT scan in a routine follow-up?
Short answer, no.
Perfect. I think that's a take-home for today. Please don't, if you see a follow-up of a patient of thyroid, do not do a thyroid PET-CT scan. I think that's a take-home message which we should hammer today. Right. So, This is the prognosis where you have these different scores, the ages, AIMS, and the MASIS score. Dr. Nayak, if you're there, I think Dr. Nayak is having some issues in joining. So, Dr. Arvind, again, back to you. These are used clinically in a practice, or you just go by, in general, size, post-therapy scan, and all those?
No, I think this has been superseded by the ATA risk stratification, which is a low, intermediate, and high. So we tend to use one of these, and as I said, there's 4 responses. So based on that, we tend to either an excellent responder, structural disease, or the biochemical incomplete, or the indeterminate response. So we more or less we tend not to use some of these scores, and they tend to be more absolute.
Okay. So, Dr. Mohan, this will be back to you. This patient was followed up 3 years later. He just has a mild cough. Ultrasound neck was normal. He was advised an RAI scan, and that picked up RAI avid lung nodules. So, is this a common scenario that happens, or if such a patient turns up, we should first do a CT scan also to do with it? Because my understanding
I would like to know what the thyroglobulin was, because that would have been my first.
It was elevated. I don't know the exact value. It was elevated. I think if Dr. Nayak is there, he will be able to tell exact value.
Okay, so that would actually what would point you to, in fact, go looking for disease. So an elevated thyroglobulin, despite having done a proper treatment, post-surgical adjuvant treatment. So then you go on to do an ultrasound neck, and then you have also done a radioiodine scan pre-therapy, which showed a radioiodine lung nodules. Yes. So that is.
So at this point, what would be the thyroid scan that you would, RAI scan that you would do? We were discussing the pre-therapy and the post-therapy. Here it will be a pre-therapy scan.
It would be a pre-therapy scan, correct. So you give a very small dose of radioactive iodine after having stopped the thyroxine for at least 2 to 3 weeks to ensure that the TSH is sufficiently elevated. Okay, so once you have a stimulated situation there, and then you give radioactive iodine, you're more likely to see the uptake. So it increases the sensitivity of it, and you do it after giving the radioactive iodine a small dose, which would be 3 to 5 millicurie at most. Remember, the treatment was 100 millicurie, so the iodine scan would be about 3 millicurie, 5 maximum. And then after you give them the iodine, you wait for 3 to 5 days, and then you do the pre-therapy scan.
Okay, perfect. So first you look for the radioiodine activity. If it is not there, then would you still detect some nodules in the lung in your scanning, or do you need to do a CT scan for that separately? Because this is a question which I have.
Yeah. So if you see, if there is no uptake of iodine, right, then you are not going to see anything. So, but you know that your thyroglobulin is high. So you know that there is something which is still lacking. So what you do, you then do a CT scan. Non-contrast CT is absolutely fine to look for lung nodules. Yeah.
No, so Vamsi, if I would like to add, Dr. Arvind here. No, as Dr. Mohan had elegantly said, what we do nowadays in practice is do less and less of radioiodine scans in the follow-up.
Yes.
We tend to follow these patients with ultrasound and thyroglobulin. Only if one or both of these are abnormal, we tend to go in for radioactive iodine scans. And then initially also we don't tend to jump. We also tend to see how much level of thyroglobulin elevation is there. If it's a very marginal elevation of serum thyroglobulin, then again we will do sometimes a chest X-ray also, or at that end. But generally we tend to avoid CT chest for these patients. We tend to do a radioiodine scan for these patients if the thyroglobulin elevation is much higher than. So that's been the traditional change in the follow-up, in which when I was training, we used to do more and more scans. Every other year, patients used to undergo radioiodine scans. Nowadays, we are very much limiting scans and also therapy also to that extent.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Dr. Arvind said that, the role of pre-therapy scan is actually is not that much these days. So we are not doing as much because our thyroglobulin estimation and reliance on it, reliability of it is actually much better. So we're quite happy if there is good thyroglobulin, then elevated, then we are quite happy to actually treat them.
So Dr. Mohan, if I can ask you, Dr. Roshni Pandey wants to know that if a patient is presented with a cord compression, I'm assuming she means a spinal cord compression due to the MET, there's hardly any time to stop the thyroxine, wait for a radioiodine scan. So what can you do in that situation? It's a practical issue.
If there is cord compression, the first thing they would need is to see a radiotherapy consultant. So that's this is a medical emergency, so they need to see that a surgeon or a radiotherapy consultant, whoever is going to decompress.
An MRI would probably suffice at that point. Look for cord compression, go in radiation or. Right. Now, this patient was followed up further. So, as you have told, there is no role for routine imaging in a routine follow-up. After 1 year, this patient did have RAI non-avid nodules, though there were no symptoms. So, at this point, what would be your take? Patient is non-avid anymore, so you hand over back to the surgeon, or what's your next step?
It depends on what the level of thyroglobulin is. As Dr. Arvind has said, if the levels are fairly low, 20, 25, as opposed to, so in this particular case that you've shown, I would be looking at something in the hundreds, if, right. That would be the kind of thyroglobulin level. So if it is still in hundreds, and you've seen that, there is no radioactive iodine uptake. Now, there are two schools of thought here. One would be, just say that this is not radioiodine avid disease. The other would be to actually, we don't know that. We will treat this patient, we get a post-therapy scan, because there is evidence to show that there is a percentage of people who are non-radioiodine avid on pre-therapy scans who will show uptake just because of the sheer dose magnitude difference. Okay, so the sensitivity of the scan would be better.
So, Dr. Senthil, if I can bring you in at this point, patient is now having RAI non-avid nodules. Patient has been referred to you because of rising thyroglobulin, let's say not marginal, rising thyroglobulin. Would you prefer giving them back another dose of RAI? Is that a standard practice?
So I think till you reach a point in time where you're certainly saying that I don't want to give any more radioiodine, I think the values or the total dose that a patient can receive is kind of little controversial. For whatever literature is available, it looks like 600 microcurie is what most people will think is the upper limit to call somebody as radioiodine resistant. So I would always talk to my nuclear medicine physician and then check if there's any scope for doing radioiodine therapy. If he or she says that there is no scope, then it falls into our domain, and then following it up depending on the symptoms and what the scans show.
So good that you brought that up. So my question to you is, how will you follow this patient up? What imaging would you use? Do you go by a strict RECIST criteria because that's what we are used with, or would you just follow up as a symptomatic?
No, I think a combination of what you're seeing on the CT scans and what symptoms the patient has, both together will determine what we will do, Vamsi. I think just seeing something on the scan does not warrant jumping into some form of TKI therapy, because all of us have seen in our, practices these patients who go on like this for years together sometimes. So I think deciding to do any therapy based on one scan, in my opinion, in a patient who does not have any symptoms would be not the right thing to do. But if patients are symptomatic, then I would like to start treating early. But no symptoms, then I would probably do a scan in the next 4 to 6 months. See if the lesions are increasing in size. You did ask me about RECIST criteria. I think that's for clinical trials, not really for clinical practice. So if there are criteria saying if you've got 2 centimeter or 1 to 2 centimeter, and if it increases by 20%, then you will probably want to do some therapy. But I think in real world practice, we don't do that. If your radiologist says that it's starting to increase, and then you're following it up and there's a steady increase, then there is a role of starting some TKI or whatever therapy might be, but not just based on RECIST criteria.
Dr. Mohan, FDG PET-CT to follow up these patients. Again, I'm coming back to that because it's done in practice. A lot of people start saying no RAI avidity, let's start doing FDG PET. Is that a correct statement?
So once you've confirmed that it's not radioactive iodine avid, so then you go to say, okay, the thyroglobulin is still very persistently high, and therefore you would say, okay, and this is a high-risk patient, remember. So he had a lot of local invasion and everything. So a very high chance that you have to radioiodine probably refractory disease. So that would be the right reason why you may want to do a PET-CT scan in this patient.
Do we need to do it, or are we good enough with a CT scan?
Dr. Vamsi, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Nayak, I can hear you. You're back. Thank you, sir.
Right.
Yeah.
So it depends
Sorry
on the
about that.
availability, really. If you've got the PET-CT available, definitely you should, because the yes.
Okay, perfect. So the reason again, now we come to this group of patients who are actually thyroid resistant and RAI refractory thyroid cancer. And the fact is, those patients do not have a good imaging on who do not attain a negative imaging on I-131 or do not have any uptake. They do much worse than the other patients. So this subgroup, it's not a very big subgroup, but that subgroup is the one which will start doing badly. So first question, Dr. Nayak, how do you define this refractory thyroid cancers? I think we are losing Dr. Nayak again. So Dr. Arvind, how do you define?
Sorry. Did you ask a question?
Yes, sir. I asked you how do you define the radioiodine refractory thyroid cancers as a definition? Okay, so I will ask Dr. Mohan and the others as well. I think Dr. Mohan has just left. Dr. Arvind, how do you define this refractory thyroid cancer?
No, there are some about 5 or 6 criteria for definition of radioactive refractory. One is, of course, as you said, like the key of element is that it should not concentrate radioactive. Again, in the real world, what you will see is some lesions may sort of have an uptake, some may not have an uptake. So again, it all depends on how the criteria is. But essentially, radioactive iodine refractory is defined by a lack of total lack or partial lack of radioactive iodine uptake in some of these cancer cells. Again, I would entirely reiterate with what Dr. Sendil and Dr. Mohan said. I think the more important aspect in this disease is the symptomatology of these patients, because a lot of these patients tend to be asymptomatic for years together. There is no hurry in sort of pushing any sort of therapy for these patients. And I myself have seen in my practice a lot of these metastatic cancer patients go on for at least few years, believe me, 2, 3 or more years also, without any intervention. So that is something that one must keep in mind, considering that the indolent nature of these cancers, even if they are metastatic.
Fine. Yeah. Munita, if you're there.
Hello. Yeah.
Molecules and rough pathway which gets activated becomes the reason for doing a D-differentiation. Do you think there's any role of doing molecular testing routinely at this point?
So there are certain mutations which are associated with refractoriness to radioiodine, BRAF, TERT promoter mutations. These are, and the doublet BRAF TERT mutations. These are reported to be associated with an increased refractoriness to radioiodine. As far as routine testing is concerned, it is not a norm still, but it is available and that can be done. So they can.
So I think that's routinely do it, but it can be done. Great. So this is what the definition is. The reason why I brought this topic up is because the definition is kind of different in different places. What Dr. Arvind was talking about, even an absence of uptake at initial diagnostic sites, absence of progressive loss of radioiodine uptake, patients who have already received 600 microcurie, or structural progression despite presence of iodine uptake. All these are some criteria which they use to define a radioiodine refractory. And even interestingly, even one metastatic lesion, more than one metastatic lesion with one lesion not showing RAI uptake, even that is known as a radioiodine refractory. The ESMO guidelines follow a similar role. The same number of things are used. The ETA definition is also the same, similar time. But only thing which they have also said is that thyroglobulin is not a surrogate for radiological assessment. It can also be used as an indicator. So again, by and large, what all our experts are saying is you should look at the thyroglobulin, look at the imaging, look at the radioiodine uptake. There is no one single character. But one thing which I want to ask is this mixed pattern, where some lesions are still having RAI, others are not. So Dr. Mohan, at this point, if you get such a report, would you still want to give RAI again if you have not reached your 600, or you think this is radioiodine refractory as per definition?
See, I'm not a huge fan of giving a certain number for treatment, therapy, or otherwise out there. So, if somebody has been given 600 millicurie of radioiodine and there is still some disease left, it doesn't make them radioiodine refractory. At the same time, if somebody has been given 400 millicurie and there is a mixed pattern of disease, as you say, and it's actually progressing on scanning, that is the key, you see. And if it's progressing on scanning, then that is the disease, that is the part of disease which will take over the prognosis. It's not the iodine avid side, it's actually the non-iodine avid disease which is progressing, which would actually determine the prognosis of this patient. So that's how I would like to be, because that's a very much a practical issue. It's more than anything else.
Right. So both sides, you may have a radiological small progression, but it will be clinically irrelevant, like Dr. Sendil and Dr. Arvind said. Sometimes even small increases can have a major impact depending on the anatomical position. So we need to look at all of these as a whole. Great.
Vamsi, just one more point I would make, Dr. Arvind here. No,
yes,
I know there's a lot of things about 600 or something, exactly as Dr. Mohan said. I think in real world, we tend to go much higher as well. We tend to go at least up to 1 curie also in some of these patients. So as long as these patients are concentrating radioactive iodine, I think one must understand in the metastatic thyroid cancer, radioactive iodine therapy is the best sort of treatment that you can give for these patients. I agree that, if the trajectory of the disease is going in another way, if only small lesions are concentrating and a large majority is not concentrating and they're progressing, then you don't really give. Obviously, that's common sense. Yeah. But by and large, we tend to go much higher in the radioactive iodine dose, and I entirely agree with Dr. Mohan that 600 is not just one thing, but we tend to go in real world much more than that as well in selected patients.
In fact, in selected patients, as Dr. Arvind found, it's 1 curie and probably even more. As long as
even more.
Disease is showing the iodine concentration and responding as we would expect it to do.
Perfect. So, Dr.
Vamsi, can you ask Dr. Mohan, when do you stop? I mean, how high can you go? Is there a final cutoff?
There is no cutoff. See, essentially, people have said if you've got more than 2 gray kind of radiation dose to the bone marrow, that would kind of be something that would direct you towards that. But actually, we've never achieved that kind of a dose in any of our testing, even when we go above a curie. So the key is this patient is tolerating it well. The disease is responding well. The thyroglobulin is coming down well in the way we would like to. I think that's fine. But then after a certain time, what I do is in practical clinical practice is that I'll give them much longer holidays, treatment-free holidays. So where I used to do a therapy once every 6 months, and I'd actually say let's prolong it, maybe 9 months, maybe even a year later. So it gives them enough time to heal as well. So
yeah. One more thing which which I have tried to do is to increase the thyroxine doses. And I have found that the progression can slightly be slowed down by increasing their thyroxine doses and getting them the maximum, which does not give them toxicity. I mean, do others practice that?
I think this is something controversial, so let's not get into it now as a discussion. Dr. Sendil, if I can call you. So wait and watch, patient is now with you because he's got a metastatic disease. You want to bounce him back to the nuclear medicine, give more radioiodine. So this game of bouncing continues till what time? When do you start treating a patient with your TKIs?
To keep bouncing till the time that they will close that door, Vamsi. So I think I just want to make a small point here. Though all the points regarding radioiodine and stuff like that is very well taken. Absolutely, that's the best treatment. But we also should understand that all these criteria, delaying treatments, doing more treatments, was in an era where you didn't have anything else beyond radioiodine. So now we are slowly moving into a time where you have certain other options. I'm not saying they are phenomenally good options that keep going endlessly, but we also will have to keep these options that are available in the context before we really say I want to keep doing this again and again and again, till we reach a point wherein patients, become sick enough and are not candidates for any other treatment at all. That's just a point I'm trying to make. I'm not by any way disconcerting what the others are saying in terms of radioiodine being the best treatment. I totally agree. But please remember that there are other options that your patient can exercise. And if you miss the appropriate time using those options, then you missed it forever. So that's the point that I want to make. Vamsi, coming back to what you were asking, if patients are asymptomatic, but I'm doing a scan 4 to 6 monthly and I see doubling of disease in terms of the measurements, then I'm a little less tempted to wait and watch. That's a situation where I would certainly discuss starting an alternative treatment. And in this situation, it's a TKI with my patient. But if my patient is symptomatic, the question I am trying to ask is this some kind of a local progression which is causing the symptoms and hence can be handled by surgery to remove something from a local site, or can you do radiotherapy to that site only? And then if the other sites are quiet, can you wait and watch? But if that kind of an oligo progression is not there and it's generalized progression, then that's the time that we would start thinking about going ahead with the TKI. So that's the way I would look at this clinical situation.
Perfect. So, Dr. Senthil, any role of the histology or any role of molecular aberrations to decide your treatment, or is it a bit far-fetched at this point?
No, I think we once the nuclear medicine physicians and the surgeons say we hands up, then I think it comes to our domain. So the algorithm that you're showing is what I referred to a little earlier ago, looking at less than 20% versus more than 20% in the past year. So we know that patients who are progressing radiologically have poorer outcomes compared to patients who are not progressing. And that's also very obvious on the clinical trial. I'm sure you will show the lenvatinib study, where the progression-free survival for patients who are in placebo, these are patients who had progressed in the past 12 months, was 3.5 months. Though it's again RECIST criteria, that's the best that we have at this point in time. So we all know that these patients have poorer outcomes. So that's why I was saying, if I'm seeing that the disease is actually doubling or it's significantly increasing in size, then I would be a little hesitant to wait because these patients do poorly and they end up needing treatment very soon. So I would act early in that kind of a situation compared to if somebody had rapid growth, as you're showing in this, wherein we would, do treatment immediately.
So I think that's a very, very good point you have raised. I think that brings me back to the same thing we discussed at the beginning. Decisions have to be made in an MDT. It cannot be just being followed up in one place. Every 3 to 4 months, there should be an MDT with others just to see if we are missing any option, or we should start TKIs early. Symptoms alone is not the only criteria. Everything should be taken into consideration. Now, this patient did follow up because he was asymptomatic and then followed up with a CT scan and developed symptoms later on. So, these are the two studies, Dr. Senthil, which we were talking about. Sorafenib in radioiodine refractory and lenvatinib in the same radioiodine refractory cases. So just to again ask you, what is your choice of TKI and what do you decide on?
I think it would be a good idea to get your molecular profiling done at this point in time, Vamsi, since we now have a few more therapies that are available for patients with metastatic undifferentiated thyroid cancer. And that would include getting your RET done. And for once, it's good to talk about NTRK, because whenever you talk about NTRK, everybody asks you who's seen this. So I think the incidence in thyroid cancer seems to be a little more. I'm not very fascinated with the BRAF V600E at this point in time, except in anaplastic thyroid cancer, because the data in papillary carcinoma of the thyroid for BRAF V600E and inhibition with dabrafenib and trametinib is not that very impressive at this point in time. So I'd be certainly interested in knowing whether the RET and NTRK is there, assuming that my patient will have access to these therapies. The second question is, if you find a RET or an NTRK, are you going to use that first line or would you keep that for the second line? I think nobody knows the clear answer to that question as of now. I would think based on the sulfatinib data that's available, it seems to be working well in the second line also. So I have a tendency to think that we should go ahead with something that's more general, which is lenvatinib in the first line, and then go ahead with sulfatinib in the second line. But that's debatable at this point in time. I would not use sorafenib as my first line therapy, both because of the clinical experience being not so great, and also the data being inferior compared to lenvatinib, though these are not trials that have had these patients randomized to lenvatinib versus sorafenib. This is a cross comparison. So that will be my thought on. So lenvatinib first line would be my choice, not sorafenib. Molecular profiling, certainly yes, to look for all the options available for this patient.
I think that's as neat a summary as anyone who can listen to can ask. I actually was very interested in looking when you looked at the inclusion criteria for both these studies. The sorafenib study looked at single new lesion that does not take up RAI, patient whose tumor has still got RAI uptake and has progressed within last 16 months. Progression after 2 RAI within 16 months and received cumulative dose of more than 600. This is what the sorafenib trial used. The lenvatinib again used kind of similar things, but they used progression within 12 months. Again, the reason I'm bringing this is because these are patients who are actually a bit out of ambit, and I agree with Dr. Sendil that generally by the time we come to patients land up with us for a TKI, we would have crossed this a long time back. So maybe we should start treating them a bit earlier. Again, this is the lenvatinib study, and what Dr. Sendil was pointing out about the PFS, this is the updated PFS, where you have a PFS of around 19 months versus 3.6 months. So the ratio is far, far superior. The hazard is 0.21, which honestly I don't think we have seen in any study so far. So with such a fantastic PFS, definitely lenvatinib would be the first line of choice, would be the first choice for any of us. So Dr. Nayak, Dr. Arvind, any experience of your patients? Have you seen taking these drugs, or what is your thoughts on this?
Well, our patients, I guess you have more experience taking care of them than we do. But somehow I found that there is a lot of reluctance to starting these medications for patients. Of course, you have your own criteria why you should start and why you should not start. And maybe advanced metastatic thyroid cancer patients, the reason being that they can live a long time even without all these drugs can be started. But shouldn't we be a little more proactive in starting these drugs than we are currently is what my doubts are. I mean, if they're going to make a difference anyway.
I absolutely agree with Dr. Nayak. I think it's because it's ingrained in our brains that thyroid cancer is only responsive to radioactive iodine and nothing else. That's why you would use all sorts of therapies to get that radioiodine back on. Just for the interest of the nuclear medicine physician and others, some of these TKIs seem to be making these patients sensitive again to radioactive iodine. So, these MEK inhibitors that are available. So, you would actually be interested in doing something like that. So, I very much agree with Dr. Nayak that we should be a little more proactive. These are drugs that work, but having said that, let's not discount the side effect profile of all these drugs. I'm sure Vamshi will, talk about it as we go by. So it's very important. Yeah, so it's very important to understand the side effect profile of these drugs because these are patients who are minimally symptomatic. You don't want to worsen their quality of life with the treatment that you're giving to them. Though we are very enamored with the 64% response rates, the median progression-free survival of 18 months, but at the same time, it's not very difficult to make your patient's quality of life worse with all of these therapies. And I'm still at a loss as to why every indication of lenvatinib has a different dose. Renal cancer has a different dose. Liver cancer has a different dose. Thyroid cancer has a different dose. I think this is the only drug, at least that I can recollect in oncology, where every indication has got a different dose. I'm sure Vamshi will agree with me when I say that none of my patients have tolerated 24 milligrams. Not that I have loads of patients. I have a handful of patients, but all of them end up with somewhere around 14 milligrams, max of 18 milligrams for some time. They end up having their blood pressures up and all that has been listed on this slide. So I'm a little concerned about toxicity. But once you start learning to use the drug and titrating your dose adequately well, then it becomes easier after some time. So the first 6 to 8 weeks can be a little difficult, but you have to sit with your patient, negotiate with them, tell them that this is not a bad drug at all, and make sure that your patient is able to use it adequately. I think that's the key.
I think if I could yes. I think it's very important as you kept reiterating, it's an MDT. You really need a multidisciplinary team for treating once you come into the realms of the dedifferentiated thyroid cancer. So when to start everything, you're much. It's much easier, and you can be much more sure in telling the patient when they would benefit, and managing any side effects. Everything would be much easier with an MDT approach. And as Dr. Rajappa Senthil said that the side effect profile definitely been part of both decision and the select trials. The 24 milligram hardly tolerated by less than 5%, and then 20 is probably what more comfortable starting with, and as you said, 14 probably 10 kind of becomes a maintenance dose eventually for these people.
So I can add my 2 bits, and I completely agree, Dr. Senthil. You need to be very careful with the dosages. It is nice on the precise part. They have a drug which actually you can do mathematics, go 10 milligram, 4 milligram, 18, all these doses.
So they know about it.
Correct. So mostly we end up with 14. I mean, most of my patients are actually 10 milligram and 14 milligram alternate day, or some fancy such things going on there. But the drug works for a significant amount of time. So dose reduction, even though we are reducing doses, it still seems to work. A final few questions, Dr. Senthil. How do you follow up? Again with a CT scan or a PET scan or symptomatology?
I quite agree with our nuclear medicine, Dr. Mohan, that if possible, it would be a value addition to get an FDG PET just to make sure that you're not missing some sites of disease. But I'm not somebody who keeps repeating PET CT scans too frequently. So if I find the most common site is the lung. So if we keep a watch on the lung, and if the other areas are reasonably quiet in terms of symptoms, then I'm quite happy following them up with a CT scan. I wouldn't do a CT scan as frequently as what was done on the clinical trial, as long as the patients are clinically well. So I would do one at 3 months. If that's fine, then probably 4 to 6 monthly CT scan is what I would do for my patients. Not keep repeating a PET unless there's a new area of symptom which is out of the anatomical area that would be covered by a CT scan.
Right. This next is for you, sir, Dr. Senthil. NCCN in thyroid. I am actually, having read all the guidelines, I somehow find NCCN to be one of the least impressive, I should say. And this is one reason. TMB high is a recommendation for pembrolizumab. Do you really agree with this? I mean, we have had this discussion of TMB high so many days.
No, I don't think I agree with this. So it's like we very jocularly remark that it's the birthright of every cancer patient to have a dose of an immuno-oncology drug before he or she dies. I think that's where we are getting to, and I'm actually not very enamored with this recommendation. I don't agree with this. In fact, whatever little data is available in thyroid cancer with the immune checkpoint inhibitors has not been very impressive.
Correct.
So, I mean, in desperation, you can do all of this. When somebody is absolutely fit, has got a pocket that's as deep and can reach the ground level, and there's money all the way down there, you can try this. There's nothing wrong. But, in general, I would not agree with it.
Absolutely. So just to add to that, pembrolizumab overall response rate in one of the studies, a single phase study, was around 8%. So I think that's much lower than sorafenib, and it's not really something that we would be going in for. Dr. Munita, just a final question for you. Are you routinely doing NGS and TMB for your thyroid cancer patients in TMH as a routine or as a part of any trial?
No, we have NGS available and it is just picking up. So right now it's not a routine, but we've started a molecular tumor board, and where more and more cases, all the cases which are coming for NGS are discussed. So as a result, the requests have increased, but it's not a routine. There's a long way to go, but it is picking up.
Perfect. Dr. Senthil, final question to you. Second line after TKIs, you give chemotherapy, different TKIs. What's your general practice? And do any of them?
If a molecular abnormality is present, certainly we would go chasing that. So in desperation, we would even chase a BRAF, though I clearly said that the data so far has not been that very impressive. So if there is an abnormality, we'll go chasing that. I'm not a great fan of chemotherapy in patients with undifferentiated thyroid cancer. Not that I've used chemotherapy in plenty of my patients. So again, as a desperate measure, yes, but the adriamycins and the platinums very rarely work as much as the little experience that I have. So I would prefer to leave them alone rather than putting them on chemotherapy. But you can differ with me. Absolutely, that's my personal.
I actually don't differ with you because honestly, I don't think anything works.
Great, I'm glad.
Yes, after first line TKIs, I have used pazopanib, I have used sunitinib, various types of TKIs, and all of them seem to work for a couple of months. Chemotherapy, I have not tried. So, final question to you, Dr. Gohan. Any experience of this redifferentiation that Dr. Sendil was talking about? Have you seen any personal patients who again became?
We have been part of a trial, not in India but elsewhere where I used to work, using the retinoids for redifferentiation. Okay. While it's all anecdotal, the actual experience is very disheartening. That's not something that has worked well. Now, more recently, we've got drugs like selumetinib that came on with a lot of promise, but haven't really taken off the way we would have loved to, because some of those images and some of the data that came out, 50% redifferentiation was unheard of. So but never kind has translated into clinical practice. So I think we're just still waiting.
Right. So I think with that, I would like to, bring this to a close. It's been a 1.5 hours of very, very interesting and at least for me, a very, very important learning experience. I am not really talking, though I thought we could discuss, but injury and anaplastic, let's not talk about it. So if any of my panelists have anything else to add, otherwise we can conclude this meeting. Dr. Nayak, Dr. Arvind, any final thoughts for the day?
The thing is that going back to your first slide where you said that, if you had one cancer, it would be thyroid cancer, and then saying that it probably is not that easy for patients to deal with it. Now, let us be clear that there are two groups of thyroid cancer patients, the young and the old. And the young do follow this principle wherein if they want to get a cancer, they should get thyroid cancer because it's completely curable and they live their normal lifespan. I have hundreds of patients who are on follow-up with me, are absolutely doing fantastically well. Then we have the other extreme, the elderly patients who get into all kinds of problems, who need iodine therapy, who need TKIs, who need ultimately chemotherapy, and ultimately succumb to it. So we have to be in a position to differentiate these two groups of patients. So these young patients don't require anything, and they are absolutely fine. And then these old patients do require everything which we have been discussing about. So this is, we can't just lump them all together. They're completely two different diseases. That's what I would like to end by saying.
Arvind, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I entirely second that. In fact, in some of our pediatric and thyroid cancer data which we published, we saw almost a close to 100% survival in of our pediatric thyroid. They do excellently well. And but on the other end of the spectrum, you do have these diseases. But it's very important to identify. For example, in the case you presented, we knew that it was a locally advanced cancer with tracheal invasion. So we knew that this patient would sort of do. So it's very important to sort of identify these patients upfront, risk stratify these patients, and diligently follow them up, because you expect some failures in some of these 6 to 15% of the patients who are expected to do badly. So they may get disease. So you must diligently follow up these patients, and I entirely agree with that elegant. In fact, I'm so fascinated by the spectrum of drugs that has come 10 or 15 years back. We didn't have any role of medical oncologists in thyroid cancers, and now, of course, there are so much of hope, at least. So it's really exciting looking for more interactions with you in the NDT for thyroid cancers as well.
Dr. Sendil, any final thoughts? Any final thoughts, or we go with the hope that Dr. Arvind has given us feel good for the day?
Correct. So looks like there is a chair that's reserved for the medical oncologist now in the MDT, which wasn't existing earlier. So I'm quite happy. So I was actually wanting to tell you, I'm glad your patient coughed, because that gives me a chance to talk. Anyway, on a more lighter note, that was but a very nicely conducted panel, Vamsi. And it was great learnings from me. In 1.5 hours, I learned everything that I tried to read in the past 3 days. So good for me. And I want to thank all the others in the panel, the pathologist, madam, Dr. Mohan, Dr. Nayak, and Arvind, for really making me wiser at the end of this 1.5 hours. Thanks so much, all of you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Mohan, any final comment?
As Dr. Senthil has said, thank you to all of you. It's been fantastic. Thank you, Vamsi, for moderating this so well. My take home for this is, thyroid cancer. I wouldn't actually hesitate in telling my patients, if you had to have a